Hello, everyone, and welcome to Safe Haven's 2019 webinar series called What's Faith Got to Do with It? Victims and Survivors of Faith. We're so glad that you have joined us today. I'm Anne-Marie Hunter. I'm the Director of Safe Havens, and with me today are Allison Morse-Katzman, our wonderful Associate Director, as well as Safe Havens' team members, Katie Oitman and Karen Liu. Safe Havens is a faith-based, multi-religious technical assistance provider for the Office on Violence Against Women. Provides support for advocates and service provider agencies on how to reach out to and engage and partner with local faith leaders and faith communities in order to better serve victims and survivors of domestic and sexual violence and elder abuse. We're Boston-based, and we work locally and nationally. We train all over the country, and please feel free to contact us if you're interested in resources or technical assistance. And we're hoping to be able to do more training in 2020. We're booked up for 2019. Anyway, we really like to provide technical assistance and resources about building relationships with local faith leaders. So it's great work, and we're deeply grateful to OVW for the opportunity to do this. It's really very groundbreaking what we do, and in partnership with all of you. So since February, we've been looking at sexual and domestic violence through the lens of various cultures and faith traditions, including why faith is important to faith-affiliated survivors. We had one on spirituality, sexual violence, and healing, domestic violence through Jewish, Muslim, and Christian lenses, and domestic and sexual violence from African American and Latinx perspectives. All of those webinars will be recorded and posted to our website. This is number 9. We've come to the end of our 9 webinar series, and today's title is Belief as Asset, Supporting LGBTQ Victims and Survivors of Faith. So you can see that this is definitely last but not least. It's so important, and we're so glad you're here. Today's presenter is Dr. Nancy Nienhuis. She holds a doctorate in religion, gender, and culture from the Divinity School at Harvard University. She served as the Dean of Campus Life, Vice President of Operations, and Professor of Theology and Social Justice at Andover Newton Theological School, where she has taught courses on social justice and intimate partner violence. And until recently, she was the Associate Dean of Student Life at Simmons University. Nancy has an interest in issues of intimate partner violence and sexual assault, particularly as those issues are addressed how clergy get trained. And her articles about that have appeared in the Journal of Feminist Studies and Religion, the Journal of Pastoral Care, and the Journal of Religion and Abuse. So as of January 2018, Nancy also has a book out. It's entitled Saintly Women, Medieval Saints, Modern Women, and Intimate Partner Violence. And it compares theological responses to domestic violence in the lives of medieval saints with contemporary theological responses to such violence. And Nancy's co-author is Professor Beverly Main Kinsley. Nancy also has an interest in using research and writing to affect public policy. So from 2009 to 2011, she was on the Violence Against Women Act faith-based committee for the National Task Force to End Sexual and Domestic Violence, which was part of the U.S. Department of Justice. Really important work. She was also recently invited by the Carter Center for Human Rights to write a piece for an annotated version of the UN Declaration for Human Rights. And that document will be distributed around the world to give religious leaders tools to argue from within their own religious traditions against gender-based violence. So she's done fabulous work. Dr. Nienhuis is currently an adjunct professor at the Boston University School of Theology. And Nancy, thank you so much for being here with us today. We're really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Anne-Marie. I'm very excited to be here. I want to thank the Office on Violence Against Women and Safe Havens Interfaith Partnership and Allison and Anne-Marie for this opportunity. This is such an important webinar series, and if you haven't had a chance to listen to any of the others, I encourage you to go online and do that. Before I launch into the webinar itself, the PowerPoint slides I have here, I want to say just a little bit about myself. So Anne-Marie told you a lot about the work that I've been doing, but some other things might be important too. I'm lesbian myself, and my partner and I just celebrated 32 years, so we're pretty excited about that. That's a long time. I grew up in the church and the Christian tradition. My father was a fairly conservative minister, and unfortunately, I grew up in a church that rejected me when I came to understand my identity as being lesbian. But I loved my faith, and much later I found a church that accepted me, and it was a lot like coming home. So it was important that I be able to find a place where I could exercise the faith that was important to me and be in a community that was accepting. So I consider myself a Christian Unitarian Universalist. The work on LGBTQ community, domestic violence, and religious belief began when I was the director of a women's center at a university in the Midwest. And women and some men kept telling me how they went to their faith leaders, their religious leaders for help with intimate partner violence, but they kept getting advice that said it was their responsibility to change the violence or it was their fault. So I decided to do a doctorate so that I could be part of the training that future faith leaders had. So perhaps down the road, fewer survivors would encounter these kinds of religious leaders. So it was really those women and men who were survivors sharing their stories with me that launched me on this path. All right. So I want to thank Anne-Marie Hunter for this image. I stole it from one of her PowerPoint slides on elder abuse, so thanks, Anne-Marie. Imagine this as a meeting of the governing board or responsible board of a church or synagogue or mosque or other religious community. As you can see, there are several elephants in the room. So one of those elephants is that intimate partner violence, domestic violence, doesn't happen in our church, synagogue, mosque, whatever the group may be. Of course, we know that intimate partner violence happens in every community, regardless of whether it's religious or something else. A second elephant is the LGBTQ elephant, which is the one that says there are no LGBTQ people in our religious communities, or we don't want them here. So we know that there are LGBT community members in every religious community, regardless of how visible they are. The third elephant is the one that says, okay, there might be some intimate partner violence in our religious community, but it doesn't happen in lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer relationships. It just doesn't happen in those relationships. And of course we know that it does. And then the final elephant is the elephant that says our religious group has no responsibility to think about or be involved in intimate partner violence. And what we've learned from the research over time is that although religious belief can be a real roadblock to LGBTQ survivors, it can also be an incredible resource. And we're going to explore that more as we go forward today. So let's start by just talking a little bit about where we're going this afternoon. We're going to talk about who this community is. I'm not assuming that you know anything about the LGBTQ community, so we'll begin with some very basic definitions. And then we're going to talk about how often intimate partner violence or domestic violence happens in the LGBTQ community. And I will use IPV/DV very often in my presentations because I was pretty much using the term IPV, intimate partner violence. But a student in one of my classes one time said, you know, when you don't use domestic violence, then I feel like my experience disappears from view. And she had been abused for many years growing up by her brother. And the term domestic violence, she felt, included her experience, whereas the term intimate partner violence did not. So I often use IPV/DV when I'm doing presentations like this. So we'll talk about prevalence, and then we'll look at sources of support and the role of spirituality or religious belief and how that can be very positive and sometimes not very helpful at all. So that's where we're going. But first, I want to get a little bit of information from you about what you hope to learn this afternoon. And when you think about serving LGBTQ survivors of faith, what are you excited about, or what is something that you're worried about? What do you think might be most challenging? So I encourage you to put your answers in the public chat box, those of you who are willing to weigh in. What do you hope to learn this afternoon, and what might be challenging or really exciting about working with members of these communities? All right, so I'm going to present you with a lot of information, but at the end of the PowerPoint, there will be a time for questions and answers. So we'll have a chance to talk together about those things that you're interested in. So let's start with some definitions. And again, I'm not assuming that you know anything about the LGBTQ community. So we're going to begin with the basics. Here we go. I want to just let you know that these definitions come from the California Community United Against Violence, California Partnership to End Domestic Violence, and the Los Angeles Gay and Lesbian Center. They collaborated to do this PowerPoint, and so these few definitions at the very beginning come from them. All right. So sexual orientation refers to a person's emotions, romantic, emotional, sexual attraction to individuals of a particular gender. And thanks for all of you who are weighing in on what you hope to learn or the things that you'd like to get out of this. I appreciate that, and just keep going, and we'll take a look at this as we go. Gender identity describes the gender with which a person identifies. So whether one perceives oneself to be a man, a woman, or describes oneself in other ways. Again, like I said, these are very basic, but I hope for some of you they may be helpful. So let's unpack that LGBTQ term here. A lesbian is a woman who is predominantly or exclusively attracted to women, emotionally, physically, spiritually, or sexually, or sexually. It doesn't have to be all of these things. It might be just in some ways. Gay is a term identifying a man who is predominantly or exclusively attracted to men, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and or sexually. Bisexual is a term identifying a person who is attracted to men and women, emotionally, physically, spiritually, and or sexually. Transgender is an umbrella term used to describe a continuum of individuals whose gender identity and how it is expressed to varying degrees does not correspond to their biological sex. So we'll unpack that a little bit more. But before I do, I want to just say that really everyone's sexuality runs on a continuum. It was many years ago that the Kinsey Institute did research that demonstrated that this was the case. And really it was groundbreaking because sexuality had never been seen that way. But what they found was that there are very few people who in all aspects of their thinking and their dreaming and their expression are exclusively heterosexual or exclusively attracted to someone who's not the opposite sex. Most of us fall somewhere in a continuum between those two extremes. And so here it talks about trans individuals on a continuum, but lesbian individuals, heterosexual individuals, gay individuals, we're all on a continuum of sexual expression and feeling. So, none of us are exactly like somebody else. But let's dig a little deeper into what transgender might mean. So, a transsexual person is one who has gone through any part of the process of sex reassignment surgery and identifies as the gender that they feel that they are. A female to male person is one who's born female but who transitions to live and identify full-time as a man, as male. And a male to female person is born male but who transitions to live and identify full-time as a female woman. And then the questioning part of our LGBTQ is referring to people who are exploring or questioning their sexual feelings, orientation, or sexual identity, and who may be experiencing lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender feelings. So this is kind of where the LGBTQ, what that set of letters, what that acronym is referring to. Now, this questioning may begin early on as a young person, first becoming aware of attraction, or later in life. And it's often the case that LGBTQ people deny their identities for many years before finally admitting them to themselves, admitting that I am who I am. And it can be much longer before they admit who they are to someone else. So it's often a process of coming out to yourself first and then to other people. Fortunately, our society is much more open now than it used to be. So there are many positive role models available in a way that wasn't the case years ago. And there are a lot of people who are available to talk to if you're lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or questioning. I wish it had been that way when I was growing up. When I was growing up, I had no idea. I didn't know anybody else who was lesbian or gay. So I felt like I was like a very unique person, but not in a good way. Unfortunately, however, depending on the religious community a person may be in, you could be welcomed with open arms, or you may feel that you have to deny your identity to remain in the religious community. So that can be a very mixed bag. What's most important for all of us who may work with LGBTQ individuals is to know that these communities, like all others, are incredibly diverse and involve people from all racial, ethnic, socioeconomic, and religious backgrounds and more, of varying abilities, everything, just like any human community. And just like working with any human community, what's most critical is treating LGBTQ survivors with respect. And that, of course, for those of you who are service providers and advocates, faith leaders, that's how we want to be working with anyone, any human being with whom we interact. Now, one way, there are a lot of ways that we can show respect to people in this community, but one of those has to do with the language that we use, or even the terms that we use. For example, sometimes people will use sexual orientation or sexual preference to describe lesbian and gay people. Well, the former sexual orientation is preferred. The preference, sexual preference phrase suggests perhaps a voluntary choice that isn't reported by most lesbians and gay men. Most people in those communities say that it wasn't a choice, it's who they are, it's their identity. It wasn't something that they decided to choose at some point. So using sexual orientation is the preferred phrase. Some lesbians and gay men have heard people contrast lesbians with quote-unquote normal women or gay men with quote-unquote normal men. And of course, this suggests that lesbians are abnormal women or gay men are abnormal men. Again, it's all about treating people in these communities with respect. And respect is also shown in how your agency clearly welcomes members of these communities. If I go to your website and you're a service provider, will I know from your website that it would be okay for me to come through your doors and seek support from you? Will your publications indicate that? Will signs you may put up in community centers or elsewhere indicate that LGBTQ individuals are welcome where you are? And this is the same thing for you as a faith community. How would I know that I wouldn't be condemned by walking through your doors? So there are lots of different ways that we show respect to each other. Let's turn now to think about how common it is to find intimate partner violence, domestic violence in LGBTQ communities. Now, I'm a person who relies heavily on research, and I love to give people who are working with me on these issues the background of where my data comes from so that you can look it up for yourself and do either confirm what I've been telling you or do your own research and further learning. So unless I indicate otherwise, the statistics that you're going to see come from these data sources. So for sexual minority women, according to the national, and I'm spelling this survey out because it's not listed on the previous slide, but according to the Center for Disease Control's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, this is a large national study which the Centers for Disease Control are wonderful as a source for information about the prevalence of intimate partner violence in various communities. And in this large survey they did, they found that 44% of lesbians and 61% of bisexual women experience rape, physical violence, or stalking by an intimate partner compared to 35% of the heterosexual women in their survey. They also found that 46% of bisexual women had been raped compared to 17% of heterosexual women and 13% of lesbians. Now, surveys vary, and other surveys have found other data. Many surveys have found that the numbers of sexual violence with heterosexual women and lesbians is comparable. Or some surveys will find one group a little bit higher than another. But this is just a report from the Center for Disease Control. Going further, they found that 22% of bisexual women were raped by an intimate partner versus 9% of heterosexual women. They found that 89.5% of bisexual women reported male perpetrators of the intimate partner violence they experienced, the IPV or rape and or stalking. The rest were female perpetrators. So this is a pretty significant statistic. That the vast majority of bisexual women who experienced this kind of violence had male perpetrators. And also significant is the fact that a third of the lesbians who responded to the study who had experienced the same kinds of incidents as in the second bullet points also had male perpetrators. Now, when we look at sexual minority men and compare them to heterosexual men, we find that bisexual men experience more intimate partner violence, and this is what was also found about bisexual women. Bisexual men report intimate partner violence less, and gay men are also likely to report intimate partner violence less often than heterosexual men are. I don't know if that surprises anybody, but they also found that 26.9%, almost 27% of gay men had intimate partner violence sometime in their lifetime, and 12% had it in the last year. This is in the study that's referred to there in parentheses. I also found that 40% of gay men and 47% of bisexual men experienced sexual violence other than rape compared to 21% of heterosexual men. When we look at the trans community, you see that the rates of violence are actually higher. So in an intimate partner violence, the rate you can find anywhere from 31% to 50% in studies. This was in the 2015 study of intimate partner violence in the LGBTQ community. And what they did was look at the research from 42 studies that had been done since 1989. So they looked at all the research they could find in LGBTQ communities. And they found that in the trans community, the intimate partner violence rate ranged from 31.1% to 50%. The lifetime prevalence of intimate partner violence or dating violence was 31% in this particular study. The lifetime intimate partner sexual assault prevalence was 25 to 47% across studies, and the intimate partner sexual assault rates were even higher with trans people of color. So violence is highest for the trans community, and you see this information repeated across studies. Although this training isn't focused on how to respond to the various groups I've discussed here, there are so many training resources on the web. So if you want more information on, how do I respond to lesbian survivors or gay male survivors or trans survivors or whatever the case may be, there are trainings and so forth on the web that you can find so that you and your colleagues or staff can be fully informed about how to respond to various communities who might come to you for assistance. One key guideline in working with the trans community is to always use the pronoun that the trans survivor themselves uses to describe themselves. So it's really important. If they use they, them, their, you're going to follow suit and use they, them, their. If they use he or she, then you're going to follow suit to use the pronouns that they use. It's just a way of showing basic respect to another human being. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and look at the similarities that occur between intimate partner violence survivors who are in the LGBTQ community and those who are in heterosexual relationships. One thing you see is that the different kinds of violence that people may experience is the same across relationships. So there can be physical violence, sexual, emotional, psychological, and as we'll see a little bit later, spiritual violence that occurs with anyone who's abused by any other person. It's also true that abuse tends to increase in severity over time. That's common across relationships. Another true fact is that the more that the person who's being abused is dependent upon the person who's being abusive, the more severe the violence tends to be. And that's because if the person who's being abusive sees that their victim is completely dependent on them, then that victim has little opportunity for escape, and the abuser will realize that they can be more violent without getting caught. And there's also common to all of us, regardless of who we are, the risk of intimate partner violence in adolescence. And in fact, when you're looking at the research, you see that so much of this violence that LGBTQ individuals experience happens to them. A lot happens before they reach the age of 18. And violence also happens early in the lives of heterosexual people. Now, the Center for Disease Control survey found that all survivors also experience, feeling fearful, being concerned for their safety, getting PTSD from the violence. That's common across relationships. And they also found that people regardless of who they were, who had histories of sexual violence or stalking or intimate partner violence, they reported asthma, headaches, chronic pain, irritable bowel syndrome, trouble sleeping, other kinds of limitations on activities. They reported far more of these symptoms compared to people who had never experienced this kind of violence. So we know that intimate partner violence, regardless of who's being abused or who the abuser is, has these sometimes very long-lasting, very severe effects on those people who survive it. Some additional similarities. Violence, this first bullet point, is relevant to boys who grow up in homes where intimate partner violence is present. That violence in family of origin puts a person at greater risk to be violent as an adult. So that is true for boys who grow up in homes where IPV is present. Girls are not likely to be more violent than girls who don't grow up in violent households. So girls aren't more violent. But the girls who grow up in intimate partner violence households are more likely to stay longer with the perpetrator of intimate partner violence if they find themselves in an abusive relationship. So they're not likely to be more violent, which is the risk that boys have, but they're likely to stay longer with a perpetrator. And I want to thank Dr. David Adams from Emerge in Cambridge, Massachusetts for this information. And Emerge is the oldest program for working with those who are abusive in the United States. It was the first one, and it's still going strong. Another thing that's common across violent relationships is that you can find elevated levels of substance abuse with both perpetrators and the victims. And you also find that dominance and control is what is behind the intimate partner violence. So in heterosexual relationships, as with LGBTQ relationships, when we're talking about intimate partner violence, we're talking about a pattern of dominance and control where the abusive person is using various kinds of tactics to make sure that the person who's being abused obeys them or does whatever else it is that they want them to do. Now, in the materials list that you see here, you'll find a power and control wheel that's called the LGBT wheel. And if you look at that, it shows you various kinds of tactics that can be used in LGBTQ relationships. So some of those you'll see are common to other relationships using privilege, economic abuse, coercion, and threats, emotional abuse, isolation, denying or minimizing the violence. Those things are common across relationships. There are some unique differences too that we're going to talk about as we go forward here. But you'll see that there are many similarities. So let's think about the differences now between LGBTQ and heterosexual intimate partner violence. One thing that's different is that in an LGBTQ relationship, the abusive partner may threaten to out the person who's being abused as a tool of their power and control over that person. And depending on where you're living and where you're working, a threat to out you may mean that you could potentially lose your job, that you may lose a religious community that you highly value. You may lose relationships with family and friends. So a threat to out you by an abusive partner can be something that would have huge negative consequences on your life. And a person might stay with an abusive partner just because of this threat that the abusive person will out you to your community, to your boss, to your workplace. Another difference between the two is the stress of being lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, or questioning in the first place. I think if you're not in one of those communities, it's hard to realize that there's a low level or medium level of stress just by having that identity because of the ongoing homophobia and heterosexism that's in our culture. So, I told you I celebrated 32 years with my partner, my spouse, which is wonderful, and thank you for those of you who congratulated me. But, even I live in New England, which is a pretty liberal part of the country and pretty open about LGBTQ issues, and yet I'll go with my spouse somewhere and I'll have to make a determination of whether I'm going to hold her hand if I want to, because I know that the threat of violence is always there, or somebody throwing things at me, or, when we went to buy a house, which we were fortunate enough to be able to do, we worried about what the neighbors would think. Would we get eggs thrown at our house, which happened in one of the houses that we bought? Would people poison our dog? There's always this low-level possibility of violence that is part of the world you live in if you're a member of one of these communities. So another issue that's different between LGBTQ and heterosexual persons is that LGBTQ populations experience higher levels of shame. And that's due to the fact that for most of our life as a nation, as a culture, as a society, we have denigrated anyone who's part of the LGBTQ population. We've said that these people are abnormal. We've sent them to institutions to change them. We've thrown them out of religious communities. In some cases in early history, people were killed. People get killed now. It wasn't long ago that two lesbians in line for ice cream with their children at a New England ice cream shop were attacked by a group of young men, and one of them was beaten to death. So, this threat, this clear indication by the majority community that you're not welcome, that you're not normal, can produce high levels of shame in some individuals in the LGBTQ population. And shame can elicit two defense mechanisms. You can attack someone else. You can have, have this anger, this shame come to a point where you're attacking someone else, or you can turn it on yourself, where you internalize the oppression that is around you, and that may result in things like depression, anxiety, that sort of thing. So intimate partner violence is huge, has a huge negative impact on anyone who experiences it. But people in the LGBTQ communities have these additional issues that they're facing, which can be on top of the intimate partner violence. There can be difficulties accessing services. In the Intimate Partner Violence Survey that I mentioned before, the 2015 survey, researchers found that survivors may not know that there are LGBTQ-friendly intimate partner violence services in their area, or LGBTQ-friendly religious bodies in their area. And they may have little confidence that when they go to a shelter, they'll be believed. Survivors may worry that shelters and others won't have LGBTQ staff members who could help them feel welcome and understood. Or they may worry that if they go to a shelter, that their abusive partner may also try to access that shelter as a way to follow them and may also be admitted to that shelter. So they may not access services because of that. Survivors may have a very low level of confidence in the sensitivity and effectiveness that police may have when responding to intimate partner violence in LGBTQ communities. And we certainly know that there has been a lot of violence for LGBTQ individuals when they've been in the hands of police. And in fact, there are surveys, research that shows that for trans individuals, there is a very high percentage of trans individuals who are sexually assaulted when they're in police custody. Well, word gets out into the community. So if you want to feel safe from your partner, you may not call the police when you know you can't be sure you'll be safe with them. And then depending on who you are in the community, if you're a person of color, if you're African American, you know what police have done to your communities in some cases, and you know that many times African American men die in custody. If you're an African American LGBT survivor, you may not want to risk calling the police because you know that your partner may be in grave danger from the police. Now, of course, like anything else, there are wonderful police officers who are well trained and respond just the way we want them to, but that doesn't always happen. Survivors may also worry about outing themselves by going to a shelter. Am I going to basically hang out my dirty laundry so that those people in the shelter or the staff can say, see, that just proves that these people aren't normal or that their relationships aren't right. Look at the violence in that relationship. Something's wrong about them. And that happens with other minority groups that, there's a sense of not wanting to hang out the dirty laundry to a public that already despises them or has stereotypes about them. There's also this sense of outing oneself, going to a shelter. If I go to a shelter, will suddenly my whole community know that I'm gay or lesbian or trans or whatever it is? If you're in a small community, that fear might be quite valid. Maybe a pretty small world where people know each other. So, when you access services, you have to think about all of these things, take them all into consideration. And survivors may also feel, embarrassment, depression, guilt, isolation, things that heterosexual survivors could feel too, and not access services for those reasons. Interestingly, in this large intimate partner violence survey, this 2015 survey, lesbians reported that money was the biggest barrier to accessing services. Now, this surprised me when I read this study. This may be because they rely on family, friends, and others for support and assistance and fear rejection if they seek services and out themselves. I'm not sure what's behind it, but that's something to be aware of. A lesbian who's accessing your services may have deep concerns about finances. Now, significantly, in this large report that reviewed 42 studies from across many years, none of the LGBTQ survivors mentioned in these studies listed religious communities as entities that were helpful to them in their struggle to survive. We need to change that. They listed other institutions, but they did not list religious institutions as an asset. And we want this to change because religious institutions can be, as you're going to see shortly, a tremendous asset. But before we go there are some myths about violence in LGBTQ communities which can also hinder their ability to fully access services. One of those is that men are never victims. Now, we know, I suspect that everybody on this call knows that, of course, there are male victims of intimate partner violence, domestic violence. Another myth is that women are never perpetrators, which could help somebody who's lesbian not be believed when she goes to a shelter and tries to talk about what happened to her. Women can be vicious perpetrators and be every bit as dangerous and harmful as male perpetrators can be. There's also this myth of mutual battering, that if violence happens in a same-sex couple, then it's just people in a fight. It's not really a situation of dominance and control where one person has power over another. And another myth is that abuse in same-sex relationships is not as severe as abuse in heterosexual relationships. And we're going to keep going with these. I want to follow up, here with intimate partner violence isn't that bad. And I want to just warn you, it may be hard to read some of these things. These are all instances of abuse that have been reported by survivors in the LGBTQ community. I'm not going to read through them, but you can see that there's a horrific nature to this violence, just as it is in violence that's perpetrated in heterosexual relationships. So this idea that it can't be that bad is simply untrue. The key here is that as service providers, advocates, or faith leaders, that you always listen with an open mind to what survivors are telling you and believe them. And of course that's true whether you're working with LGBTQ survivors or survivors who are heterosexual. Now there are some additional fears and challenges that LGBTQ survivors face. We mentioned this one about abuse not being taken seriously. They may not get acknowledgement of the violence they're experiencing or support in that violence from the LGBTQ community itself. And this could happen because, especially it could happen anywhere where, I just don't want to deal with the fact that lesbians are also violent. I want to have this other view about lesbians that we would never do this to each other and that it's men that do this to women. Well, it's simply not true. But if I want to deny that, then I may just not believe or want to believe, or I might discount what someone else is telling me who's also lesbian. They may not get support from the community because, again, the community doesn't want to hang out this laundry, doesn't want to acknowledge that it exists in our community. They may be re-victimized by the outside community, and I've already talked about the various ways that could happen. They may fear rejection from the religious community, and I've touched on that. And fear being outed, I've touched on that. And they may fear that the abuser will convince people that it's the abuser who's the victim, not the person who's actually experiencing the violence. So a lesbian may fear that if she reports the abuse, police will come and believe the perpetrator that she's the victim of violence. Or, there have been cases where police have arrested the wrong person. They've arrested the victim instead of the perpetrator. There have been cases where police have arrested them both because they haven't been trained properly in how to assess situations when it's lesbian or gay male survivors. So these can all be parts of the fears and challenges faced by LGBTQ survivors. Let's turn now and look at intimate partner violence and religious belief. I want to take a few minutes to look at the prevalence of domestic violence, intimate partner violence in religious communities. Now this will highlight one of the elephants we saw in the room in one of our earliest slides, namely that many religious communities believe that intimate partner violence, domestic violence, doesn't happen within their religious group. I may want to think it happens to that group across the street, but it would never happen in my home church or synagogue or mosque. The reality is that levels of abuse are similar inside and outside of any particular group. So let's take a quick poll before we launch into this further. And you'll see this comes up. Have you worked with LGBTQ survivors of faith? And so why don't you take a few minutes and respond to that poll. Looks like a lot of you have. Good. Okay. All right. And I encourage you to just keep, looks like we've got 42 people on the call. So I'd encourage you to just keep weighing in as we go here. Now, the second part of this is, okay, if you have worked with these survivors, have they raised concerns about their religious belief and the intimate partner violence to you? And if yes, what were they? And I encourage you to put that in the chat box. So if you're one of the, looks like about 66.6% so far of you have worked with LGBTQ survivors of faith, if you have, and if they've raised concerns about their religious belief and intimate partner violence, why don't you let us know what they might have been, and we'll have a transcript of the public chat that we can refer back to this as we go further in the webinar. So I encourage you to take some time to raise any issues that LGBTQ survivors might have raised to you about their religious belief. Okay. Now, we're going to look at intimate partner violence by religious practice, and I'm going to give you a snapshot of various religious traditions, of research done within those traditions. So we're going to start with Islam. This, in an online survey with 801 respondents, this is what they found. 31% reported domestic violence in a relationship at some point. 53% reported a form of intimate partner violence at some point during their lifetime. So not necessarily, it might have been violence from a family member other than an intimate partner. Another survey of 9, now I want to say too that this survey of 801 respondents, the respondents were self-selected, so it may be more likely that survivors took the survey as opposed to perpetrators, just FYI. Another survey of 9 U.S. domestic violence organizations that served Muslim survivors found that among those survivors, 82% experienced emotional or verbal abuse, 65% experienced financial abuse, 9% experienced spiritual abuse, and that could be something like, being physically violent just before they were going to go to the mosque for a service, and so they couldn't go, or jeopardizing or sabotaging their participation in some group that happened at the mosque, or using teachings to tell them that something about them is wrong or they're not a good Muslim. And we're going to talk about this further. 74% reported physical abuse, 30% sexual abuse. Now, another study found that 71% of the intimate partner violence survivors were women, another study done in the Muslim community. 12% were men, and 16% were children. This was 190 people who were all in counseling in Northern Virginia. One thing I want to note is that 56% of the respondents in the large survey of 801 people said that they'd heard a khutbah or sermon at their mosque on domestic violence. 56% had heard a sermon on domestic violence. So if that's the case, the mosques are ahead of a lot of other religious organizations in terms of the amount of preaching that's being done about intimate partner violence. Okay, if we move forward. just a few data points about intimate partner violence in Judaism. One thing that researchers have found is that Jewish women tend to stay longer in intimate partner violence relationships, 7 to 15 years on average versus 3 to 5 years on average for non-Jewish women. Other than that, the domestic violence rate is similar to the general community, and domestic violence and intimate partner violence happens in all branches of Judaism and at all socioeconomic levels. If we look at a Protestant group in Christianity, this survey came out of the United Church of Christ, which is a Protestant denomination, and they found that 1 in 3 women experienced intimate partner violence, 1 in 10 men reported it, 25% of the women reported marital rape. This is significant. Women were more likely to seek help from a therapist or friend than from a pastor. And that's a really sad commentary and shows that the work of organizations like Safe Havens that goes out to train religious communities about how to respond is needed as much now as it ever has been. 85% of clergy said they referred someone to an intimate partner violence agency, but fewer than 25% of those same clergy had referred an abusive person to a batterer's intervention program. And obviously, if those who abuse are not going to intervention programs where they may learn how to change their violent behaviors, then that means that there won't be fewer partners down the road for those abusers who are being abused. We need to stop the violence, which is in the hands of the abusers, to stop. When they learn how not to be violent, that's good for everybody. But the clergy were not referring the same number of abusive people to programs as they were referring survivors to programs. Now, this was a fairly large study done in conjunction with the Faith Trust Institute, which is an organization that also has tremendous resources for those of you who want to learn more about intimate partner violence in various religious communities. They have DVDs, they have training materials, and if you Google faithtrustinstitute.org, you will find their materials. Now, one thing that's true about religious belief is that it can be a huge roadblock to someone's safety, or it can be a tremendous resource. And what we know is that, what we know from the research is that when religious beliefs are a resource, they are uniquely helpful. They can really support survivors, and they can play a major role in holding abusive people accountable. In some cases, they can be even more effective than the judicial system. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. First, let's look at how religious belief can be a roadblock. This is a quote from an interview I did with someone who's bisexual. And she said, "The church shut the door to my career by telling me that as a bisexual person, I could never be a pastor, so I left the church." So here is a person who really felt called to go into pastoral ministry, really felt that that was what she was supposed to do. But the church was basically telling her that someone with her identity could never get through the ordination, the process, the educational process it takes to become a pastor. So she left the church. Let's continue with this. Now, one of the things we know about religious belief is that when people are in crisis, they will often turn to any kind of religious belief they had when they were children or when they were growing up. It's just one of those things that happens. I get into a jam and I think about this thing that was a source of comfort and safety and support for me early on in my life, and I may turn back to that to try to get support now when I'm in this huge situation of intimate partner violence. When people turn to religious beliefs or turn back to religious belief, they may misunderstand the teachings in their traditions. They may think that those teachings require them to remain in an unsafe situation, or others, religious leaders, or the perpetrators of abuse may use religious teachings against survivors, misinterpret them to tell them that they need to stay and not try to leave a particular relationship. Intimate partner violence is a crisis that's often physical and emotional and psychological, and we know all the different ways that it can be a crisis. What we don't focus on all the time is that it can often also be a spiritual crisis. If LGBTQ survivors feel that they can approach their religious leaders for help, they may get the same bad advice that clergy give to heterosexual survivors of abuse. They may be told to pray harder. They may be told to try to get their spouse or partner to the church or the synagogue or the mosque. They may be told to lift the abuse up to God or Allah. They may be told that God or Allah is punishing you. All of these things have been told to survivors of intimate partner violence when they've gone to religious leaders. They may be told that marriage is a lifetime commitment and they have to stay in it. If they're Christian, they may be told that their abuse is an opportunity to show that they can be live a life of sacrifice like Christ sacrificed himself for the church. That person may be asked to sacrifice their safety for the marriage. They may be told to treat their partner with dignity and respect, and they will come around. They may be told to forgive the abuser and take them back. And remember that this advice only comes if survivors aren't afraid of approaching their religious leaders. This advice may come when survivors feel like they can approach them. The thing that all of this advice has in common is that it makes stopping the abuse the responsibility of the survivor. And as we said before, only an abuser can stop the abuse. The person being abused cannot stop it. And so this advice is not going to be helpful. These leaders are often trained to interpret their traditions in ways that are harmful to LGBTQ survivors. And these examples of advice demonstrate that so clearly. Now let's take a moment to look at some of the teachings that are significant across religious traditions. For example, in Christianity, sexism is inherent in the history of the tradition. If we look back at the early church fathers, and when Christianity refers to early church fathers, they're referring to the group of people, it's a big group, whose teachings laid the groundwork for everything that came afterwards, the practices, the teachings, and they can be seen sometimes reflected in even current teaching in some aspects of Christian traditions. Now, I realized when I was going through my slides that I should have put these guys, these early church fathers, in the order of their time, and I didn't do that, but I'll do that as I walk through the slide with you. So Tertullian, whose full name was Quintus Septimius Florens Tertullianus, was somebody who lived in the 2nd century. And he did a lot of writing on how awful women were. I've read a lot of it. One of his famous statements was that women are the devil's gateway. And for me, that kind of sums it up for what old Tertullian thought about women and men. He thought women were a threat to men's sacredness. And he had a lot of warnings in his writings of men to stay away from women and how women were supposed to behave so that they could be a little less dangerous to men. Augustine lived in the 4th century, and one of the things that he wrote was that since women sinned first in the story of the Garden of Eden, husbands had to be their masters. And he played this out in real life in his own family because his mother, Monica, was abused by his father. And one of the things Augustine praised Monica for was the fact that she never left, and she just took the blows that his father gave her without complaint. She was, in Augustine's eyes, the model of a Christian woman. Now, Thomas Aquinas lived in the 13th century, and one of his famous sayings was that women's bodies had a deleterious negative effect on their souls. So my soul is in jeopardy just by virtue of the fact that I have a woman's body. And I can't underplay for you the significance of the vast amount of writing that especially Augustine and Thomas Aquinas did, and how their teachings laid the groundwork for Christian belief for centuries. John Calvin, who lived in the 16th century, he said that women have a cross to bear from God and should not leave an abusive marriage. So he actually also wrote about abusive marriages. He also said in his writing, he described how when his own wife, Katie, got a little bit, in his words, saucy, he would hit her. So he talked about how he controlled his own wife if she stepped out of line by hitting her. Now, Christians today, at least most of them, are unlikely to believe these things about women, but we've inherited this very sexist, very homophobic tradition. And we've spent decades trying to undo the damage done by early teachings that set the stage for all subsequent teachings and practices. And the same can be said for the vast majority of religious traditions. We're fighting still today the impact that earlier writings continue to have. So, similar teachings are part of every religious tradition, as I said. Here are a few from Orthodox Judaism. One says you can prohibit sexual relationships between individuals of the same gender and base gender roles on birth biology. So if you have to prohibit same-sex relationships, then obviously someone like me can't be a part of Orthodox Judaism. Or if I have to base my gender roles on birth biology, then if I feel like my birth biology doesn't match who I truly am, I'm going to not find a very warm welcome in Orthodox Judaism. There's also an emphasis on binary gender and strict separation between men and women. When you look at Catholicism, the Catechism says, although the particular inclination of the homosexual person is not a sin, it is a more or less strong tendency ordered toward an intrinsic moral evil, and thus the inclination itself must be seen as an objective disorder. Now, of course, you're going to find people within Catholicism that don't believe this way, but this is part of the Catechism of the Church. And for those of you who are not familiar with the word catechism, Christians have catechisms too, and it's a set of teachings that's often used for children and those who join this belief group to kind of indoctrinate them into the belief. When I was a child growing up in my father's church, I had to learn the catechism as part of what we did in Sunday school. And it was like a question and answer. You know, what is the sole source of salvation? And the answer would be Jesus Christ. So it would be this, sometimes it's sort of a call and response or a question and answer. That is how new individuals to the faith or individuals who are born into a tradition learn the teachings. And many of those teachings harken back to some of these earlier religious fathers. And certainly Catholicism and Christianity share the same religious fathers up until the Reformation. And so you can see hints of those voices in both sets of teachings. If we look at Islam, imams are trained in culturally conservative non-U.S. schools, and so when they come here and are going to lead a mosque, they may have been taught in a culture that really is out of bounds with what most Muslims believe. There may be Islamic immigrants from countries where LGBTQ individuals are punished by death. Now, they may be fleeing that as an LGBTQ individual themselves, or they may be someone who is believing that and here and believes that and becomes part of a community. There may be a fear of being ostracized from mosques and community centers. Intimate partner violence may be blamed on the person because they're in the LGBTQ community. There may be a correlation seen between, and in some studies, there's been a correlation between Islamic beliefs and anti-gay sentiment. In the past few years, a school for imams opened in the Boston area, and there are more that are coming. And that's because the Muslim community itself realized that we want imams trained in our society so they can better serve who we are as Muslims, American Muslims. And so that's a very positive turn of events. Additional roadblocks that LGBTQ survivors face is fear of rejection, the shame of being LGBTQ, years of messaging discrediting your sexual being, and an internalization of the tradition's homophobia. We touched on many of these things before. There's a negative impact of religious belief on survivors if they believe that God allowed the violence to happen or didn't help them, or feel that they've been abandoned by God or Allah. They may believe that God or Allah is punishing them for something they did. They may feel silenced by their religious belief or blamed by it. And these, again, are things that we've touched on. Let's turn for a moment to this idea that religious belief can be an asset. What we're learning from research is that those who have religious beliefs can be helped by them immensely. It can be a powerful force for good in the lives of survivors. One lesbian person I interviewed told me, I found a church that would accept me as I am, and that has been very life-affirming. Every religious tradition has life-affirming resources. It's always a mixed bag, but here are some of the life-affirming resources. In more liberal areas of Judaism, you find statements like, we are committed to the full welcome, acceptance, and inclusion of people of all gender identities in Jewish life and general society. In looking at Protestantism, over 5,000 Protestant churches in the U.S. are welcoming and affirming of LGBTQ people. Looking at Catholicism, the bishops said themselves that as bishops, and this has to do with intimate partner violence, as bishops, we condemn the use of the Bible to support abusive behavior in any form. A correct reading of Scripture leads people to an understanding of the equal dignity of men and women and to relationships based on mutuality and love. So as with any organization, views can vary a great deal within every religious tradition, from complete acceptance of LGBTQ people to absolute condemnation. So you never know when a survivor comes to you to talk to you, if you're in an agency, if you're an advocate, you never know what their experience with a religious belief might have been. Again, you have to listen carefully. In Islam, Marriage, in the Quran, these are all pieces from the Quran. Marriage should be based on mutual love and compassion for purpose of mutual tranquility. Well, a verse like that never allows intimate partner violence. There's no room for intimate partner violence there. Communication should be positive. Mocking, name-calling is prohibited. In Zen Buddhism, the third precept says the expectation is not to harm, exploit, or manipulate others. These are really positive statements when it comes to survivors who are in these traditions. And you need to know that survivors may not realize that these positive aspects of their tradition exist. They may have been beaten over the head by teachings through religious leaders who used their teachings to try to keep survivors in an abusive relationship, or by abusive partners who used teachings that twisted teachings to suggest that they could not be safe and be in the religious community. But in fact, there are these positive messages, life-affirming messages, violence-prohibiting messages in every religious tradition. This is why it's important for you as advocates and service providers to partner with religious groups that get domestic violence, that are on the side of turning the tide of intimate partner violence, so that when you have a survivor within a tradition who has never heard the life-affirming messages, you can call the imam you know who is really a wonderful advocate for survivors and have that person come over and talk to the survivor you're working with, so that survivor can see and receive a life-affirming message from within their tradition. That can be very, very important. When we step back and consider the research on religious belief, there's some really wonderful news, religious belief and intimate partner violence survivors. So I'm just going to touch briefly on the 3 studies I have here on the slide. The one study showed that survivors for whom religious belief was a positive part of their lives, those survivors had more self-esteem, a sense of greater self-efficacy, and higher life satisfaction than survivors who did not have positive religious communities in their life. Another study found that connection with a positive religious community meant that that survivor had fewer PTSD symptoms and they didn't last as long as survivors who did not have that kind of positive religious community support in their lives. And the third study found that survivors who were connected to a positive religious community, their recovery from trauma was facilitated by that religious belief, by that supportive community. They did better in their recoveries from trauma of intimate partner violence. When survivors are able to rely on their religious beliefs, it's very life-affirming and has a demonstrable positive impact on how well they recover from intimate partner violence. When you step back and consider this research, and there's a lot more out there that I could have put into this webinar, but when you step back and look at this, it's really quite remarkable. You'd be hard-pressed to find something else that would have this same positive impact. And there's more. Research shows that having a religious or spiritual belief in and of itself is very life-affirming for LGBTQ individuals, as it is for heterosexual persons. Belonging to religious or spiritual communities has very positive effects on people. For LGBTQ individuals who have been rejected from their communities, finding a faith community that loves and accepts them can be a life-changing event. This is a study here of remarks from LGBTQ individuals about the positive impact of their religious communities. They found love and acceptance for their identity. They found a sense of purpose and deeper meaning by being connected to these religious communities. They felt compassion, empathy, and openness that was grounded in their own identity. So their own sense of being able to be compassionate and empathic and open to the world was enlarged because they had this base in a positive religious community. They found a new passion to live out their own spiritual values because they were loved and accepted. And they found that their membership in these religious communities had a positive impact on their relationships with others in their lives, with their family, with their community, with a spouse or partner, because of shared religious values and a sense of being able to be oneself. They also found renewed strength and resilience in the face of the discrimination that we experience so often. But this base of this kind and open and affirming religious community gave them greater strength and resilience. So these religious beliefs are empowering. They connect individuals to a large community in important ways. They help individuals live out the values that are so important to them. Research has demonstrated all of this. And I can't think of another activity that someone might be involved in that would have the same kind of positive impact in their life. When religious leaders are helpful, their role can be critical. This one study found that compassionate clergy counseling, so now we're turning to religious leaders, not just the religious communities. The compassionate clergy counseling can have a positive influence on psychological outcomes of women in abusive relationships. So here we see that when a survivor can interact with a religious leader who is helpful, that it can have a very powerful impact. One resource you have in your materials is called Pieces of a Bigger Picture. It's a pastoral response wheel showing the various ways that religious leaders and religious communities can help support all of those in their communities, including LGBTQ survivors of intimate partner violence. If you're a religious leader, this could be a very useful resource. And if you look at that, I want to just highlight two aspects. The one is the part of the wheel that says get training. I can't emphasize enough how important it is for people in religious communities to be trained about intimate partner violence and faith and religious belief. Because if they're not trained, they may end up espousing some of these aspects of their tradition that can be so life-threatening to intimate partner violence victims. They may keep a person in an abusive relationship while they think they're doing good because they're speaking out of their tradition. It's really important for them to get training. And the second thing I want to emphasize is this piece that says educate the congregation. Leaders of congregations, of communities can come and go, but the people remain. So it's not just the leader that needs to have training. It's the people in the congregation that needs to have training. And there again is a place where safe havens can be really important because they will go in and train both leaders and members of a religious group. But take some time with that wheel because that also has some really important aspects to it. Here are a couple of other examples of how important clergy can be, and this time for those who are abusive, for batterers. One study found that when clergy referred batterers to intervention programs, the abusive people were much more likely not only to attend the program, but to eventually finish the program when compared to abusers who were referred solely by the judicial system. So the clergy were actually more effective in getting people who were abusive to stay in a program than a judge was. And they found that when clergy and the courts referred male abusers, the rates of program completion were even higher. When people who are abusive are held accountable by their faith communities, by their religious communities, it's good for those who are abusive and it's good for the survivors because there's a chance that there will be less violence in the future. Now, the implications for domestic violence and intimate partner violence advocates are some of these that I have listed here. First, you can't assume that somebody who's religious is automatically going to have negative effects. As we've seen, religious belief can have positive effects. It can add to someone's trauma, or it can mitigate the adverse effects of trauma. Given the research, it's imperative for clinicians to integrate a focus on religion and spirituality into service. If you can't talk about religious belief with your survivors because of certain stipulations that you're under as an organization, then it's really critical that you have relationships with people who are religious leaders who you trust so that they can talk about religious belief with your survivors. And you as an advocate, as a service provider, have to be aware that belief can be a mixed bag with positive and negative effects. You have to remind yourselves, because you see many examples of religious belief being negative, and believe me, I understand that. When I teach my classes to future religious leaders, when I teach classes on domestic violence to future religious leaders, and they start understanding the dynamics, and they go to their local shelter and offer to be someone who can support that shelter. Time and time again, they come back to the class and they report that the shelter they went to or the agency they went to told them that they were the first clergy person, first religious leader that had ever gone to that shelter other than with the goal of getting a woman to go back home to an abusive man. So I understand that there's a lot of negative experience that providers and advocates have had with religious people, with religious organizations. I've had those negative experiences myself. But what we know from the research and what we know from interviewing survivors who are part of faith communities is that religious communities can also be powerful supporters of LGBTQ survivors and help us all hold those who are abusive responsible for the violence. So what can advocates do and faith leaders do? Listen carefully to what survivors say about their beliefs. Respect those beliefs, even if they're not beliefs you have. Understand that religion can be a huge roadblock or wonderful resource. Introduce yourself to religious leaders who affirm LGBTQ individuals. Collaborate with religious leaders to keep survivors safe and those who abuse accountable, and offer to train their congregations on how to respond to intimate partner violence in LGBTQ communities. These are all really important things that you can do. And again, you don't have to do this alone. There are places out there that can help you help congregations learn how to do the right thing when LGBTQ survivors find themselves in violent relationships. Let's take some time now for questions you might have. I'm so excited again that you have decided to spend this time and I would love to have a Q&A with you and respond to those things that might be important to you. Anybody have any questions that you want to raise?
Nancy, while people are typing, I wanted to raise something with you that was put in the chat box early on. One of the advocates, Katie Campbell, typed in that one of her challenges is being able to use sensitive, appropriate language when discussing faith with a client when she is not herself personally, the advocate is not herself personally practicing religion. And I was just wondering if there. I also typed into the chat box that Safe Havens has a guide about constitutional guidelines when you're receiving federal funds, and that can be really helpful too. It's on our website.
Yeah, thanks, Anne Marie. Yeah, that would be a really useful resource. And Katie, I think what you can do, if so you could feel like you're kind of wandering into a minefield and worrying that you'll say the wrong thing and end up being the opposite of what you want to be, instead of being supportive of the person and open, come across as someone who's not going to be welcoming, when that might be what a person of faith is already fearing when they go to an agency. I think being really open is important. You can say to a person something like, I'm hearing that your religious belief is really important to you, and I want you to know that I respect that. I may not have the same beliefs as you do, but I know that many people who have experienced this kind of violence have found great comfort in their religious beliefs. And sometimes they've found challenges. They've believed they have to choose between faith and safety, that they can't have both. And it's at this point when it's crucial for you to know people in your community from different religious traditions that you can call upon to talk to a survivor who's going to give them a message of empowerment. So at that point you might say something like, even though I can't, I don't share your belief and can't discuss all this with you, I know Reverend so-and-so, or I know the imam at the local mosque, or I know Rabbi so-and-so, who really is a supporter of survivors of intimate partner violence and would love to be able to talk with you about your beliefs and how your beliefs can be a source of safety for you as you face this difficult situation. So I think I would respond like that. You don't really have to know anything in particular about a particular religion. You have to be open, you have to be accepting, you have to be respectful, which I'm sure comes naturally to all of you. But then you also have to have done a little homework about who in your community could be a good partner when these kinds of issues come up.
Nancy, I'm afraid we just have time for one more question because we're a little over time already, but there is one from Alyssa. Can you point us to studies demonstrating effectiveness of rehabilitating batterers?
Yeah, great question. What I would recommend is you go to the website of Emerge, emerge.org, because they do have studies on their website, and you will be able to find more. The good news is there have been substantial changes in abusive people when they've gone to state-certified batterer intervention programs. And I want to emphasize state-certified, because those that are not, you don't know what you're going to get. It's also the case that it can take a person who's violent going through a program a few times before they really change. They have learned these ways of interacting with others often since they were children, and it is not an easy process to change that kind of thinking and that kind of behavior. It does happen. Some studies, some research that's been done gives you a pretty dismal picture, But, you know, the more we do this, the more we work with abusive people, the better we're going to get at it. And the better we'll know what's most effective and what's not. So it does work it does work sometimes. It's not 100%. It's not 60% effective. But it does work, and we have to keep referring people to these programs because what else can we do? This is what we have. But David Adams is a terrific resource, and you could even reach out to him personally. He's a really open and accessible person whom I highly recommend.
Thank you so much for this, Nancy. I'm so deeply grateful, and I think we all are. There's lots of thank yous in the chat box. We've all learned so much. And I want to thank NCJFCJ as well for hosting all of our webinars, and this one included. And to all of the participants, I can't thank you enough. I just think that we're beginning this conversation. There's so much more to say. Nancy, I'd like to talk to you for another 2 days and get to all the questions and so forth, but this has been really, really helpful. So all the webinars, as I mentioned, have been recorded, and you'll see our website here on this last slide. And Nancy, thank you again so much for a wonderful presentation. You can reach out to us at Safe Havens. We're happy to help with resources and technical assistance, or if you just want to talk about the work you're doing with faith communities in your local area. We're hoping to have more training dollars for 2020 as well. Maybe we can come to your local area. But reach out to us. We would love to talk with you. We know that sometimes this is lonely work, and so we're happy to talk with you and make sure you know that there's lots of other great people doing this. So goodbye for now to everyone. Thank you so much. And Nancy, great presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you so much.